And the first speaker would be Elliot Wilson. He's the lab manager for Sensi Lab at Monash University. I think he's very, when I looked his career, he's very versatile. He is responsible for operation of the research space, contributes to Sensi Lab project as an engineer, educator, and researcher. His research interests include real-time 3D graphics and games, including virtual reality and visualization, emerging interfaces and interactions, mobile and wearable technology, 3D printing and digital fabrication, robotics and electronics. It's almost everything, I think. So let's start Elliot Wilson's presentation. Please start when you're ready.
Great, cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. It's really good to be here. I don't have a lot of time, so I think I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen. Cool. So, thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk about kind of the work that I do within Sensi Lab, and also just kind of a bit more about some of the ways that working on a whole host of different things, disparate projects, can kind of crystallize knowledge into a way that allows us to work across a host of different things, but in a way that is, I guess, sustainable and iterative in terms of the way that we work on all of these various projects. I guess, who am I? Well, on paper, I'm the lab manager of Sensi Lab at Monash in Melbourne, Australia. But realistically, in terms of the type of work that I do, these could all apply to me. A kind of creative technologist, a maker, an implementer of ideas, and a kind of generalist in general, I guess, working across a whole host of different things. So if we're talking about what practice is, I would say that kind of the idea of implementation is my practice, taking ideas and making them real. And that takes a whole bunch of different forms, whether it's, implementation in terms of virtual implementations through like software and things like that, all the way through to physical, actual building of physical objects. So within Sensi Lab, what kind of things do I do? Well, in the keynote that John gave early on, he spoke about the idea of a community of practice. And I think that's really important for what we do. Sensi Lab is a community of practice. We have a lot of people who work on a whole bunch of different things, but they all do it through practical and practice-based ways. And my job is to make sure that they are supported in being able to realize the kind of goals and ideals that they have within this community of practice that we've built. So a lot of my day-to-day stuff involves kind of management of equipment and kind of ensuring that everything's running correctly within the lab. However, a lot of that also involves kind of the gathering of the technical expertise that are in the areas aligned with the lab's research focuses. So the things that people want to be able to do, I kind of spend a lot of my time trying to work out how that can be done. So I do a lot of research into these emerging technologies. When we buy or work with new types of equipment or new pieces of technology, I kind of dive into those and try to understand them as best as we can. I also try to impart this knowledge out as much as I possibly can. So I run a lot of training and workshops within the lab, trying to help people kind of take all of these we have a huge array of different technologies within the lab, and trying to kind of get that out to people to make it understandable. I also provide kind of technical assistance and development on various projects. So part of my job is to support projects in a kind of developer role. So I write a lot of software, I design a lot of hardware, I do that kind of work. And you can't really overlook this stuff. It's not as glamorous, it's not as fun, but there's also a fair amount of administration work that needs to be done, like procurement of supplies and equipment, and dealing with occupational health and safety issues and things like that. Somebody's got to do those kind of things. So I do a lot of that as well. So I think that kind of first point of being a facilitator is really important in my mind in terms of the work that I do. I facilitate the practice that the other members of the lab want to undertake. One of the things that I really wanted to focus on in this talk was looking at the technology itself. Given that that's a lot of what I do, almost every project that we work on within the university, within SensiLab, is at its core has an element of technology associated with it. That's what SensiLab does. And through the lens of this technology, links between different projects become clear. We have lots of different projects that tend to have different goals or outcomes, or different parties that are interested in the research themselves. But we always approach them with a similar approach, this kind of iterative approach. And for me, it is a technologically driven approach. I'm not going to say that that's the approach that everybody within the lab takes, but for me, in terms of the work that I have to do, a lot of the time there's a focus on the technology, because that's going to be the part that I work the most on. So what I thought I'd do is I'll give kind of 3 example projects within SensiLab that I've worked on quite a lot, that I think have very differing outcomes. Like the final product tends to be quite different to each other, but the way that I've approached them and the way that they've fed off each other, I think is really important. So the projects I'm going to show involve a lot of custom hardware and electronics design, but I've noticed these kind of links between technologies on lots of different projects using different types of technology, like AI projects, VR, AR projects, digital fabrication projects. It's all the point I'm trying to get across is the link that you can find between projects when you're looking at the technology that is associated with them. So the first project I want to talk about is the melanopic eye. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the melanopic eye is a wearable sensor that we've been developing for a little while now, most of this year. And the idea is that it's designed to inform the wearer of the quality of the light that they're experiencing. So there's a lot of research into the effects that different light environments have on sleep specifically. So a good example is if you're exposed to a large amount of blue light in a period when your body should be winding down to get ready to sleep, it can make sleep harder to achieve. It can also make the quality of that sleep less good. So we're collaborating with a group in the medicine faculty at Monash who are kind of world leaders in this research to try and create a device that makes it easier for people to understand their lighting conditions. It's a small wearable device that they have on their person at all times, and it's constantly monitoring the light. And it's paired to a smartphone, and it gives a kind of report about the light conditions that you've experienced. So here are just a few quick little shots of some of the development we've done. So this project involved developing a custom circuit board with a kind of Bluetooth microcontroller and the light sensors. So you can kind of see the light sensors up in the corner of the bit in the case, and then all of the kind of electronics that goes around that. The end goal is to integrate them into something that's quite refined. We've been talking about pairing it with a light. And this is another good example of some of the collaboration that we do. We're working very closely, not only with the medicine faculty to understand the science behind the light, but also very closely with our design faculty. So we're working with industrial designers who have a lot of experience in designing kind of devices that people want to use. So we're looking at incorporating it into a kind of environment, a kind of ecosystem, I suppose, where at the end of the day, you put your phone down to charge, you've got this lamp, and the light that's coming off the lamp is the right kind of light for the current time of day, based on the data that's been coming from the sensor. And then you put the sensor down to charge, and it's all kind of one holistic ecosystem. So that's something that's kind of coming along. So I'll get you to kind of keep that project in your mind as I kind of switch gears to a totally different project. So this is what I do a lot of in my day-to-day work, is switching between projects. So the next project I want to talk about is the Drawbot. So the Drawbot is a custom robotics platform. It's capable of drawing on a sheet of paper placed beneath it. There's a number of different sensors that allow it to kind of understand its environment. And there's a pen mechanism that allows it to mark the environment in different ways. The kind of conceptual goal of the project is to explore the notion of computational creativity and the idea of an artistic output from a computational system. And one thing that's worth talking about in this project is it's a really great example of the iterative nature of the work that we do. So we've done a number of different revisions, and each one kind of addressing the problems of the last one. We do kind of like a good critique of the project each time we kind of reach a point. So we'll set up something and we'll work out how it works. And then we'll see where it fails, and we will kind of incorporate that knowledge gained from the failure into the design of the next one. So here's a quick rundown of all of the different Drawbots that we've had over the years. So this is the very first one. This was a very explorational kind of development. It was using an off-the-shelf robot, and we just stuck a pen on it. And that gave us a whole list of shortcomings, which we started to kind of refine. So we moved on to a robot that looks more like this. This was our first attempt at designing our own platform to do the robotics, to do the kind of motion. So instead of using a off-the-shelf robot like the one there, we kind of designed our own, 3D printed a whole set of parts. That was great. This actually ran in a gallery in Moscow for a couple of months, and they did a lot of really interesting work, and it was a really good kind of outcome for the project. But we found all of these other problems. Lots of parts didn't work very well, so we iterated again, designed it down. You can see the battery changed. We made some changes to the way that the battery would work, kind of worked on the design a little bit more. And this was good again, but then finally we kind of really narrowed into the final design. So I like this kind of evolution that we can kind of see here as it gets more refined each time. This version here was the result of a workshop that was run actually in Shenzhen. We took some students over to China to, am I being told to hurry up? I can't see my chat, but anyway, we took some students over to China to, sorry, oh God, there we go, to kind of run a design workshop for this robot, and we came up with a new design, which we think really kind of illustrates the project and is a great outcome. And I think we're kind of focused in on this one. I'm just going to quickly rush through because I think I'm running out of time. The last project I wanted to talk about was the Smart Footwear project, which John mentioned briefly in the keynote as well. So the Smart Footwear project is basically involves kind of embedding a custom sensor in a pair of shoes. The sensor measures pressure and temperature. And then all of that data is logged to a module that can transmit it wirelessly to an external device. And this project is a really good example of a project with commercial support. So there's an Australian footwear brand that's associated with this. They've provided funding for the project. So we're starting to see these different kind of potential outcomes. So this is also quite an iterative process. It started off as a very rough prototype, as you can kind of see here with all these wires kind of running everywhere. It's been refined into something that's a bit more refined. It's got a lot of kind of bespoke, customized electronics embedded within it as well. So just finishing up, this is the kind of key point that I want to get across from my talk today, is this idea for me of this technological cross-pollination. So every one of these projects has a very differing outcome. We've got a commercial outcome, we've got like a medical outcome, we've got an artistic outcome. Like they're all kind of different outcomes for different purposes, but in developing all of them, they have all fed into and kind of informed each other. There isn't any one of these projects that hasn't worked, hasn't had an effect on another project. In fact, I'm kind of sneaking in a little bit talking about some of the stuff that Alan's going to talk about. So the first point, you know, like all of the Bluetooth work that was done for the melanopic eye, I directly implemented into the AirSticks project, which Alon's going to talk about in his talk. The motion detection methods from the Drawbot were directly integrated into the smart shoe and then refined yet again and implemented into the melanopic eye. All of the power management, they all use batteries. So all of the power management work that was done for one is applicable to the other. And it's this kind of working on all of these things. And the last point I really like, the original melanopic eye had a light sensor that we were using. And the way that I was reading that light sensor, I realized would be a really good way to read the pressure sensor as well. The melanopic eye moved on and we actually threw that light sensor out. And in some regards, you would think, oh, that's kind of wasted effort. But because I was able to see that link between the footwear project and the melanopic eye, even though the melanopic eye isn't using that technology anymore, and we've moved past that, it's found new life in another project. And I think that that's really, really important. And that's kind of something that I am very uniquely placed to be able to see, these like much finer grain connections between these projects. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone over time. Apologies if I have. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Elliot Wilson. It was a very interesting presentation. Actually, I'm very immersed into your presentation, so I should have alarmed you earlier. But when I noticed it was only 2 minutes left. Mm, okay, so thanks for the excellent presentation. And our next speaker would be Dr. Ellen Isar. He's an Australian-based drummer, composer, instrument designer, and researcher. He's also very versatile. He's the co-designer of a gestural instrument called air sticks. Mm. Alon is researching the application of air sticks to the field of health and well-being, with the goal making music creation more accessible to the broader community. So, Dr. Ellen Isar, start your presentation when you're ready.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. And you can see this first on-brand slide, as all three of us will have. And please do let me know if you want me to finish up a little early, because I got caught up in Elliott's speech as well. And he did mention air sticks and other projects, but I'm going to focus more today. Firstly, I do want to acknowledge the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation that are traditional custodians of the land which I present on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And there is a thread through practice-based research, I believe, that goes back long before academia. So I think there's some thread that I want to talk about today is my relationship between my practice and research, and not so specifically on the air sticks necessarily. So yeah, thank you, Soshin, for inviting me and us today, and hopefully this can inspire some conversation in the chat. So, next slide. Okay. So yeah, I'm a drummer, an improviser, a composer, an instrument designer, and a practice-based researcher. As a drummer, my background involves doing a lot of different types of performances, and I'll kind of just skim through these. Includes playing with other musicians, circus performers, actors, and visual artists over the past 20 years, but I also work a lot as a sound designer and composer for theatre and for installations as well, but also writing in small bands. And a lot of my relationship with music is collaborating within small ensembles. And I have a lot of different interests that I want to kind of talk about today, but I'm going to focus on, I think, on the last one here, which is the role of different types of disciplines and different types of researchers, scientists, computer programmers, music therapists, because I think that's the privilege I've had going into the field of practice-based research, is expanding my collaborations into other fields, not just with artists and musicians, but with people such as Elliott, technologists, with people such as Camilo, who come from an architecture background, and just exchanging ideas, and those ideas bubbling away and creating new things that I probably wouldn't have created just working with musicians. But also what's important here is blurring that line between acoustic and electronic music, which is a big part of the air sticks, and also between the performer and the audience. So I actually started doing practice-based research before I realized I was doing practice-based research. Because when I was finishing my I was finishing my arts degree very slowly in philosophy and music. I was maintaining my arts practice and getting by as a professional drummer for hire. And I wrote a thesis on one of these projects, which was based around true egoless collaboration. This project was hard to describe, but it was a tribute to a band that didn't exist. And basically, we would set up these tribute nights that were an invitation for audience to make up stories about this fictional band, sing songs that never existed, but imagine that they were written by this fictional band. And it meant that it really brought people together, not just musicians, but also artists, visual artists that made album covers, poets that made lyrics that we would then turn into songs. And it was really a way of trying to create a collaboration that none of us could own. We all had to chuck our ideas into this egoless, copyright-free pit in a true collaborative spirit. So yeah, I realized throughout the thesis that this was actually a practice-based thesis, but I didn't include any of my practice in the thesis. The project also was funded by the Australia Council for the Arts, so it was funded from an arts point of view. And in my thesis, I explored the themes of how the internet was underused as a tool for this online egoless collaboration. And then from then, I kind of went back to going, well, maybe there is some funds and ways of doing projects within academia. And in 2018, I started a PhD based, again, in collaboration, but this time collaborating with the Airsticks, with all sorts of musicians, dancers, and so forth. And so just to give you brief background on the Airsticks, they were in my practice long before I started this PhD, but they only came to life just before I started the PhD. So they were invented along with a computer programmer, Mark Havriliv. And again, this was an early collaboration with someone outside my field, which was really exciting. And what we wanted to do was to create a way for me to combine the expressive nature of acoustic instruments with the endless possibilities of digital sound. And through this technology, allow me to reinvent and reimagine the connection between sound, movement, and often visuals. On a technical level, all we were really doing is taking gestural data from motion sensors and converting them into sound and visuals. But the real creative problem and research problem was how to turn this data into something meaningful. And also, I think a large part of my research is to try to invite the audience through these performances to imagine for themselves what the possibilities of technology might be. I won't play a short clip because of time, but I'll maybe send a link to people of seeing that. So yeah, my project started well before PhD, and I wanted to kind of bring attention to this because I think as artists, we are researchers before we even enter the academic field. We have a way of looking into things and trying to solve problems within our own practice a lot of the time. And I think doing research allows us to, or entering academia can often allow us to open up beyond our own practice as well and try to solve problems outside what we want to do in a performance with, you know, other people. But also the other way around, like I've worked on a lot of theatre shows where we're trying to really communicate something very important for us in a different way that academics can really communicate through theatre, through performance, through storytelling. But yeah, so I had a very complicated electronics setup early in my career with a hat that manipulated the sound of the electronic percussion I was playing. And at the same time, I was exploring what other musicians were doing with electronics. And there was a lot of drummers that inspired me to pursue this path. At the same time, I was in the studio writing very complicated music and trying to figure out how I'm going to perform this live. And there were a lot of producers that inspired that for me. So I'm kind of harping back on this idea that as an artist, you are constantly researching. You're going out and seeing other artists and putting things together and seeing what's out in the field in a very similar way that researchers do. So when we went out to try to solve this problem of how to perform electronic music live, combining the skills of a drummer with the skills of a producer, we took to motion capture technology and we tried some different systems out early on, cameras, exoskeletons, and finally we found a VR gaming controller that allowed us to then build some software that basically became this blank canvas. This software, now we can use any of the data information in musical ways. We've converted it to MIDI. So at the start of my PhD, the big questions were, well, what do I make and how do I move to make those sounds? What sounds do I make? And luckily for me, I had a wonderful mentor and my only supervisor, Andrew Johnston, and his thesis actually became a really important reference for me because it was one of the first theses that I had read that was very much practice-based. He had designed an audiovisual instrument that would allow horn players, trumpet players, sax players to be able to improvise with a visual system that they could interact with that also produced sound that they could improvise with. And the way he wrote out his...
Sorry to interrupt. So could you show us the video a little bit? I think that's very important part.
Oh, sure. I hope it works well over Zoom.
My name is Alon llsar. And these are the air sticks.
So I might end it there because it does go for, well, that video only goes for 3 minutes, but the show goes for an hour. And the show is available actually online, so I can send a link to a whole hour show where the air sticks are used, but there's also elements of miming and interactive visuals and live drumming and so forth. But yeah, the video does speak louder than explaining the concept of the air sticks. But at the start of my PhD, after seeing the way that Andrew had written about his PhD, he basically just encouraged me to go out there and use the air sticks and perform as much as possible and be in situations that you need to be in as a musician, which is in front of people, in a rehearsal studio, in a studio, recording studio, and see how to develop this. And I kind of quickly realized that practice-based research really is about practice and self-reflection and a discovery of new knowledge through the practice and the self-reflection, and also communicating that knowledge through artistic and the written outputs. And my thesis actually ended up being quite a long thesis, and that was the way that Andrew was interested in communicating those practice-based ideas, was to have a lot of case studies and discuss the work a lot, show a lot of videos, but also shine a lot of light on it through the words themselves, the text. So just a quick overview of some of the case studies. I first did a performance in 2013, and I wouldn't play this video because it's just so awkward. It's so embarrassing the way I'm kind of moving around and don't know what sound to make, how. But it was really interesting to look back on some of this and see how this was developing. And I think this is a process that I had to go through, was this kind of one-person band dilemma, was this dilemma that I had to play by myself for a while because I didn't want to involve other musicians in this process of me learning how to play this instrument or what this instrument could do, even though really what I wanted to do was to perform with other people. So again, the first question was, what sound should I make? And again, as a practicing musician, I looked at what other musicians were doing, and I decided to look at room feedback, look at the history of how people were using microphones to create music. using feedback, using electronics. In a similar fashion, I then started sampling other musicians and looking at what were the ways that other musicians were. So I'm just trying to create a thread here, I guess, that this is all inherent in our practices. We go and watch performances, we go and see art, and this is part of our kind of literature review. And through that, it inspires us to find our niche and find something very original. And I've seen a lot of artists who don't do this kind of research and end up doing things that I personally don't find very original. I see them as things that have been done before or don't build on a thread and a history of what's been happening. I might skip a little bit because it gets a bit technical, but basically I found my role that was strongest was to be a drummer, because that's where my background was. And this was where I really wanted to take the project, was to play in ensembles. So Sticks project was my main outlet for that. Again, I have a short video. I might play 20 seconds of that and then just quickly wrap up. Give the bass player any of his solo. So that was a project with Sticks, and I'll skip a few slides just to get to some of the work I've more recently been doing at SensiLab. So I did work a bit with dancers and choreographers, and I've worked with visual artists, but most recently I've worked with visual artists that you can see Sojourn there in the middle, and John McCormack behind her, and Nina. This was presented at TEI early in the year, where I was trying to blur that line between the performers and myself and the audience, using a point cloud of the audience in real time, using cameras of the room to track them in the room, and ideally, when we can go back into this project, use them as the instrument. If the way they move around the room will influence the sound and the visuals on the screen, that then I can pilot and work with how they shape themselves in the room. And then I've also started giving the controllers to other musicians, dancers, sound designers, and most relevantly for the research was to find ways of empowering people with disability to explore sound play with these gestural instruments. And just to touch base and go full circle into Elliott's piece, I've been working for a while on creating new hardware, but it's really become much more exciting at SensiLab to work on this project. And students have started to come into it. And as Elliot said, a lot of shared knowledge is starting to come into the hardware from different elements. So yeah, thanks for having me today, Sojourn. Hopefully inspires some discussion.
Thank you for the excellent presentation, Dr. Ellen Isar. Wow, that's very interesting. And I like the video a lot.
Oh, great.
Okay, then our final speaker is Dr. Camilo Cruz. He's an, yeah, I watched his work a little bit, very impressive. He's an architectural designer and researcher who's currently working on the development of bio-inspired generative systems to drive digital fabrication process using fused position, modeling, and other techniques. His focus is on the use of evolutionary principles and machine learning as a means to open up avenues for innovation and creativity in design. Wow, I'm very excited. So, Dr.
Thank you, Jaegeun, for the kind introduction. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Just like Alon did, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As you already know, my name is Camilo Cruz, and my presentation is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones. I'm going to focus on one specific project that I've been working on for the past year, or a bit over a year. We don't have a name for the project yet, but it's all about growing 3D printable organisms. And we use the metaphor of organisms because it's, as you mentioned, Jaegeun, it's a bio-inspired generative system that we're using for 3D printing, for digital fabrication. The structure of the presentation is very simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and this is how it ties up to practice-based research. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background as an architectural designer and how that feeds into the way I do research. I myself in particular do research, and then how that fits within the context of SensiLab to develop these projects and to explore creativity through technology. So a little bit about design. I know that John gave a bit of a definition of practice-based research, and these two concepts, knowing how and knowing that. So this part is knowing how, and it's about my experience as a practitioner, as an architect. I started about 15 odd years ago as a young architecture graduate working at a small firm. I had the luck of working at a small firm and having some of the projects that I worked on materialize. So I actually could see some of the buildings that I designed built, and I could enter them and knock on the doors and open windows and do all of those things, which are very exciting. But what excited me the most at the time was the process of getting to this point. How did we start with an idea and then we get to this? And I did that for a number of years. Then I moved countries, but I continued to do that. I continued to kind of work towards these really polished images. But what was interesting to me was the process, was what was behind. So this is what sparked this curiosity about not just how to make nice things or how to create good designs, but what makes those designs good. How do we get from all of these options, which are really boring white renderings with different granularities and different textures on them, to something that is a little bit more refined, and then end up with this, which could be an inhabited space that has some vibrancy, has some glamour, and it looks kind of nice. So that, as I said, this is what triggered the questions that I've been researching for the past 8 years, I think. What makes a good design? How does the design process actually work? So what do we do as designers to get to a good design? And how can we take advantage of the technologies we have at our disposal to facilitate that process? So as you can see, computers were ubiquitous already in the early 2010s, even further back. So at the beginning of the 2000s, we were already drawing in the computer. We took that further and started producing computational imagery to present our projects, to show other people what this would look like, to kind of give life to those projects. But if you think about it, they were still tools very, very similar to the tools we would use, or traditional architects would use. They're very similar to just drawing, doing watercolor representations, and then more accurate renderings by hand. We had the advantage of having 3D modeling and 3D rendering tools that allowed us to have lights and to bring in trees that look realistic. So yes, the final images were a bit more polished, or a bit more believable as realistic renderings of what things could be. But we weren't actually using the computer and the technology that we had to our advantage. So that's what triggers the third question. And that's what brought me into design research and trying to understand, trying to get the know that, trying to understand how the project actually, or the design process actually works. I pretty much, in every presentation, I do bring in 2 of these 3 quotes. I included the third one this morning because I think it also speaks volumes to what I'm talking about in this particular project. But so this idea that everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed to changing what exists into something that we would like to be. So it's designing to start is a transformative action. The second quote speaks about this idea of you're not only transforming, but you're only displaying new physical order. So you're making new things with what you have at your disposal. And finally, the process can be somehow paralleled to the process of natural evolution, where you as a designer create a bunch of different alternatives, and then you go through those alternatives and select the ones that you think are the best ones. And then through a number of operations, transform those alternatives that you have in front of you to make them better. The problems come with that idea of better and what better is. And that is part of the research that I'm going to show right now. So this is a very quick example. I'm going to just try to go very quickly because I know we're short on time. But this is a very quick example of the project that of this study of the design process using evolutionary tools. As I said, trying to take the mantle from this last quote, saying that actually design can be equated or parallel to natural evolution. And so this is what John and I have been working on for the past year and a half. What we're doing essentially is creating a synthetic design process. We are designing design or meta designing in a way. What we're doing is we are creating a system that is capable of producing alternatives and then filtering through those alternatives, telling us which ones are good and giving us the good ones, basically. And we do this through 2 processes that are iterative. So very much like what Alon and Elliot were talking about, this idea of producing something, taking a very good look at it, understanding exactly what's right and what's wrong, and then stepping back, giving it another try, and going at it again. So looking at it again and seeing what are the pitfalls and the shortcomings and what are the advantages of what we're doing, to incorporate those in future generations or in future iterations of what we're producing. It's very much like that, but we try to bring all of those decisions into the computer. So we have to give instructions. We have to tell the computer what to do. For generation, we're resorted to differential growth, which is a process that happens in nature that we thought produces a wide variety of patterns that we found really beautiful and interesting and complex and appealing. So we want to harness the power of these processes to produce something that is artificial. We set up the constraint that whatever we produced had to be 3D printable. So one of the instructions that the computer has is to evaluate if the things that we're producing can be 3D printed in a simple way. And we make use also of a quite sophisticated evolutionary algorithm that is freely available. We have not manipulated or changed the algorithm in any way. It operates on I'm not gonna get technical because for the sake of time, but it's called CMA evolution strategy. It's a covariance matrix adaptation evolution strategy. So what the system does is it takes our instructions based on this differential growth and produces hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different alternatives of things that it thinks we would like, right? And it also evaluates if these things will be possible to print on a 3D printer. These all seem very similar, but if you look closely, they have slight variations in them. So you can see that this one has 2 spikes up there. This one has only 1 spike. The spike remains here. The second spike comes back. This one doesn't have any spikes up there, etc., etc. So you start seeing little variations and little changes as a reflection of the computer actually, or the system actually searching through all the possibilities that it can generate, giving us the best ones at every time step that it is generating something, right? So then when we have all of these, the computer says, okay, this is the best one. And when the system says it has a good one, we say, okay, let's print it and let's see what happens. It tells us what's good and what's not good through these heaps of information that we can process, analyze, and look at very, very closely. Once we have made a decision, we put them in the printer and we fail miserably. And that happens quite often, actually. And it's, again, very similar to what Elliot was saying. You have put together a lot of work into an alternative that is supposed to work really well. You put together your prototype, you set it off, try to run it, and it does certain things well. So in this case, it started to print. It was going well, but at a certain point, it failed. And that failure led to other failures, and it became an unprintable solution. So we had to discard it. What do we do with this? Because we really liked it. So what we do is we tell the system again to refine it, right? So we have another evolutionary routine in place that allows us to go from an initial alternative that we like. You'll see it's a very short clip, it's like 30 seconds or so. So we start with something that we like, but was not really printable because it had a series of problems. And then we set it off to refining, and you can see that the same base remains. The upper part is changing ever so slightly, and then it slowly starts to settle into something that the system considers to be better and better at every time step. And you can see the little graphs at the bottom telling us, yes, this is the blue line tells us how printable that is. And it settled, and it gave us the final alternative. So basically, after that, we can say, okay, this is probably better than the one we started with. And we managed to print it and to make it look, we managed to get what we were expecting, right? And just like that, we managed to do multiple prints and to produce a wide variety of different objects that are appealing. In this case, we are using the design process as an umbrella, but these objects they don't have any purpose. They're only a proof of concept that the system actually works. We're moving into applications that actually could have a real life impact. But yeah, so that's how the system works. And just to wrap it up, to summarize a little bit, in the context of practice-based research, for this experiment, we draw on the creative practice experience that we have as artists, as designers, as architects. We connect that with our understanding of the technology that we have available. In this case, it's not just the use of the computer, but also how to use certain algorithms and certain routines that will allow us to will allow the computer to discriminate between what we think is good and bad, and that's where the main problem is. How do we tell the computer what's good and what's bad? The final outcome is that we managed to actually develop and refine a synthetic version of the design process, and at the same time, by observing the behavior of the system and our interactions with it, we also learn about the design process itself. So it's a two-way learning process. We use our experience to develop this system, but then we use the system to understand what was wrong in our experience, or what part of the understanding of the process was not quite right, and we can tweak. So it's kind of a co-evolutionary process between us as practitioners and us as researchers in moving forward in building this understanding of how technology and creativity go together and how we can harness the power of both into making better things. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Camilo, for your excellent presentation.
Yeah.
I like the expression by Dr. Camilo, the meta design, designing the design. Actually, I think what we are doing in this forum is meta research. We are researching how we research in different discipline of academics.
I think Eugenia raised a hand. For the questions.
Sorry, I have a question for all three speakers, actually. So one thing I'm curious about is sometimes it seems that it's hard to convince practitioners that they are indeed researchers, maybe because there's sort of this myth or stigma that you have to do a lot of writing or a lot of number crunching in order to be counting, you know, your work counted as research. So I guess what I'm curious about is for any practitioner who is maybe not yet embarked on doing academic research, do you have any suggestions for like gently entering that space, or for ways for them to talk about their work that would be seen as legitimate research?
I can leave that off because I think I spent a lot of time in my talk talking about me almost not knowing as a practitioner that I was a researcher, and then becoming a researcher and going, oh, I've kind of been doing this all along. And the reason I mentioned Andrew Johnston, my supervisor, is because he really was that figure for me, and now John McCormack as well. People who have been in the academic field for a while, but have maintained an arts practice and really know how to differentiate or blur those lines, and how to bring people in to that academic world and how to play the game to an extent. And I don't think every practitioner would want to be a researcher. I know a lot of musicians who don't want to reflect as well. So I think it's that kind of element. It's a certain type of practitioner that might be a reflexive type that could enter research, but also I think I was lucky that I had a technological element to my project. I had previous projects that didn't have technology involved, and I think the technological elements often are much more celebrated in academia because they seem to have other things that can be used from that technology being developed. So yeah, I don't know. I guess, Elliot, you were always going down the academic kind of path.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a different kind of field, and I'm actually really interested in academics becoming more creative, almost more than practitioners becoming academics. Like we have an amazing research assistant here that's been with us for a year now, and he has an engineering background but has started to create art, started to do installations, and I think he brings really interesting things to the arts practice. So yeah, I think it's a two-way conversation, but yeah, maybe Camilo can pick up as well because he's had that architecture background.
Yeah, I'm actually going to flip it to you, Eugenia, because what I've experienced is that there's a lot of, especially architects and designers, that say that they do research, but the research would never say that what they do is actually research, because it's basically browsing the web for references and then extracting bits and pieces of those references without actually reflecting on what they're doing. So I think what the point that Alon brings, it's key. The idea of part of being a researcher is reflecting on what you do, but rigorously, not just not just on the surface. So it's not just saying, oh, I'm great, what I'm doing is great and everybody loves it, so I'm going to leave it at that. It's actually a little bit like what Elliot did in this kind of journey that he showed us of his projects, where he manages to actually pinpoint which are the elements of each project that connect to each other, and how he's building a narrative through his work. That requires a very deep understanding of what you're doing, but also a very careful reflection on that practice and on the ramifications of what you're doing into more general applications. And I think that is where you find the balance between research and practice.
And I'll go on the record. That's hard to do. In fact,
yes,
for someone like me, it wasn't until 2020, if there's a silver lining at all, that work changed a bit, that I was able to take that step back and start to really crystallize and see these kind of deeper connections between all of the disparate kind of pieces that I've been working on. And yeah, I think that's really hard to do. And as Alon mentioned, there are people who don't necessarily want to do that, and if they don't want to do that, then that's fine as well. Like they don't have to. But I think it's that kind of focus on process and that celebration of failure in some regards as well, I think is very important. Like, able to look at something and go, okay, this didn't work. I'm not going to hide it. I'm going to utilize it. Whereas if you're a practitioner, of course you're going to hide it. Like if you've got a dud gig or a bad whatever you've made and you don't want it out there, then you're not going to put it out there. And that's fine if that's your end goal. But I think the research element comes in when you start to really reflect back on that.
Yeah, I think it links to this idea in traditional research that disproving your hypothesis is as valuable as proving it. So if you have a hypothesis and then go through the process of trying to validate it and you find that you were wrong, someone else can learn from that and can take that further. Whereas if you just show success, it's very little that you can actually learn from the success of others or build on top of the success of others. And if you hide the failures, it's likely that other people will run into the same problems and into the same failures. So in a research context, I think the celebration of failure is also a very, very valid and very important point.
Because I think we kind of have a very important keywords on like based on these talks, like iterative process, and also like Elliot says, cross pollinations and like blurring lines and collaborations. I think that kind of keyword and also that reflection. So I think that kind of keyword is pretty important for practice-based research, especially like for you guys' work. How traditional research can embrace those kind of practice research methodology.
I think a lot of it ties into how you do it, right? And also what your values are and what you're trying to achieve. But I think, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I think a lot of what we've spoken about already really, like, it shifts the emphasis away from the goal. This kind of, I'm very, very big proponent of like that celebration of failure, I think is, and I've said it before, but I think that's really important. And to me, that makes it, if understanding is your end value, then you actually get more understanding, because you know not just what works, but you also know all of the things that don't work as well. And a lot of the time, the stuff that doesn't work in what you set out to achieve will work in other examples. The last example I gave in my talk about how the technology that we were using in the melanopic eye ended up being superseded by a new idea that we had that was a much better fit, which you might see as a very wasteful, a wasteful piece of effort, right? There was a lot of work that went into making that particular piece of technology work. And then we went, oh, actually, there's this other thing and it's way better. And we kind of threw it all away. But it was that ability to then go, okay, but I know that it does kind of work. Like, it was a failure for this project, but I know that it is still part of it. So my understanding of my practice and the way that I can do things has increased beyond just the hypothesis or the goal that I was trying to prove previously. And I think that's really important.
Great, thank you.
I think that the title for the forum is actually coming out even without anyone addressing it formally, but finding balance is what this is about. I don't think we're saying that practice-based research is the way to create art or the way to discover more knowledge, or it's just another tool that we want to try to push out there and make sure that there's other ways of looking at these things and finding balance within the way that you approach, and I think this is to do with goals and values, you approach planning. So you plan to do a performance and you have certain parameters and you have to find balance within that to go, well, maybe by the time that performance comes around, it will be quite different because of the discoveries you've made or the things that have changed. But as long as you stick to the value that you're aiming for, the performance would actually be stronger than if you just stuck to your guns and said, no, I have to do this conceptual piece and it has to stick with this within these parameters. So I think the theme of finding balance has actually come around and with more strength than I originally anticipated.
But generally, the knowledge obtained through the practice-based research is kind of individualized knowledge. And how can we generalize the individualized knowledge? Is that possible, or it's useless, or what do you think?
Well, it's hard. It's not easy, and I think it's a case by case thing, because I'm interested in this idea of design in a more general way. What I try to do is to actually generalize what I find through my practice into something that is kind of broader and could apply to design practice more in general. But that's my specific case, and it's also mediated or biased by my own experience, through my own experience. So I think it's a bit different from traditional scientific research. Yeah, and I think that's where I don't want to say the problem, but that's where the complexity of practice-based research lays, is in how do you actually step back and generalize to a point where others can use not just your experience, but apply what you did in their own practice, kind of in a straightforward way. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it's partly up to the other researchers to take that, though. Like, it's partly I think when I watch you talk about your work, there's no clear thing that would make me go, okay, well, I'll play a different drum beat. Like but it's much more abstract. And I think it's important for us to look at each other's work and just absorb it and try to figure out slowly. It might come up, oh, that's right, that concept is there. I think it's a bit more abstract than that. And that's what we're dealing with in art. We're dealing with more abstract concepts. So yeah, I don't think the onus is on you to tell us, here, this is what you learned from this. I think it's also on us to figure out what to take from it.
And that's where I just chime in and saying, like, to document and expose as much of the process as possible. If you want to try and get this out there, the best way to do it is to bring as many people into the process that you're going through as possible, through whatever means you can. Like, if it's a big write-up of all of the successes and failures throughout the whole process, or if it's kind of, you know, reviews and crit sessions and all of that kind of stuff, I think really helps, because it is that abstract distillation that's very ephemeral and kind of hard to say, but the more chances you have for that to happen, the more likely it is to happen.
Would you say it's key to be able to communicate your process in the clearest possible way so others can interpret? So you're not saying others, this is how things are done, but you're telling them this is how I did it in the best way possible, so they can actually take it, interpret it, and test it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, you want to kind of get it out there in the best way that works. Yeah. Or I think it's going to be based on what you're doing and who be interested in what exactly the form that takes. But yeah, I think so, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it was very fruitful discussion, especially about the iterative nature of PBR and how we self-reflect. So the next session, we have a speaker, Professor Andrew Johnston from University of Technology, Sydney. So let's continue our discussion next month.